Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for joining us today on Wednesday, the 12th of May, for the third in the series of our Business Admin Level 3 Assessment Plan update. Joining me today, I have Liz Henderson. Morning, Liz.
Morning, everyone. I'm Liz Henderson, as Dom just said. I'm the lead independent endpoint assessor for Business Administrator Standard in City and Guilds.
Thanks, Liz. And Judy?
Good morning. My name is Giusy Poliseno, and I'm a development manager looking after the business skills. Business administrator, customer service, as well as leadership and management.
Thanks, Judy. And Mandy?
Morning, everyone. I'm Mandy Slaney. I'm the lead industry manager for everything to do with business. Welcome today.
Thanks very much. So between us four, we will be presenting today on any updates that we have, and we'll be giving you an opportunity to offer the question and answers at the very end. As per usual, any questions that we can't answer, time constraints, or it might be that we need to go away and get further clarification, we will prepare a frequently asked questions document. Now, this particular webinar is based off the back of the frequently asked questions, or your questions that you've answered previously in March. And so we will endeavour to go through as many of those as possible, and any that we don't get to, as we say, we will try and answer in a further document. So now we've introduced ourselves, we will turn our cameras off and save bandwidth and move on with the webinar. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, so the objectives of today is to basically look at the new assessment plan AP03 in a little bit more detail. We're going to look have a quick recap for those that haven't managed to join in the past. We're going to look at the mapping of the assessment methods from Judy, and then we're going to introduce Liz, one of our lead LIEPAs, who's going to go through the project presentation, any questions asked by the assessor, the submission of the presentation, and what makes a distinction apprentice. So looking at the past versus distinction areas of evidence, as well as some of the tricky corners that you might run into, or hopefully not, during the on-programme and endpoint assessment. And then finally looking at resources and giving you an opportunity for questions and answers. We always record the webinars, and so after the session you will receive a recording of this webinar, normally the same day, which will be sent to your email address. If you don't get a copy, it will be uploaded onto the City and Guilds website under the qualifications page. Okay, so without further ado, just going to do a quick recap on the new assessment plan 03. So as we know, back in 10th of September 2020, IFIT released AP03. You can tell which assessment plan you're working off by looking at the top right hand corner. It only impacts all those learners who started from the 10th of September. So an ILR start date at 10th of September 2020, that learner should be on AP03. Any other learners, it's business as usual, they should be on version 1. So we are now open for registrations for AP03. So for those from the 10th of September onwards, should be registered on 947322. We are pleased to announce also that our City and Guilds EPA packs are now available for 947322 and can be found on both our EPA Pro platform and our City and Guilds website. You will find, if you're going onto the website, that you need a password, and that password can be found in walled garden. We are also open, we're going to be taking bookings now for 947322, so AP03 from October 2021. So a learner can first sit endpoint assessment from October. Now the reason for this is because any learner will have started from the 10th of September 2020, needs to be on programme for 366 days as a minimum. We generally find it's slightly longer by the time you've gone through Gateway. So we'll be looking to go through endpoint assessment for any learners starting after on or after 10th of September from October this year. We just want to highlight as well that if any apprentice has any special considerations to take into account, these must be identified at Gateway so that we can prepare and let our independent endpoint assessors aware of any special considerations or arrangements that might be needed. Should you need the documentation to apply for any special considerations, please do follow that link below, where it will take you to our centre document library, and the drop down menu, as you can see in the screenshot on the right hand side, will look at the access arrangements there to fill out the relevant documentation. Just to recap then, the standard itself, the KSBs have not changed. So it doesn't matter if you're on version 1 or the endpoint or assessment plan number 3, the KSBs have not changed. So because of that, it won't impact your delivery. As we said, ILR start dates of 10th September onwards must follow AP03, which means they must be registered on 947322, and we are now open for registrations. To keep you further in the loop, we appreciate that this is the third in the series of webinars for AP03. We are going to be hosting a fourth in the series in late summer. So bearing in mind, EPA will take place from October onwards on this particular assessment plan. In late summer, we will be doing a follow-up webinar, so number 4, which will look at the processes and any other further questions that you've got in preparation for endpoint assessment on this new assessment plan. So we know then that the KSBs haven't changed, neither of the assessment methods. It's still an online multiple choice test, which still ideally will be completed first. There is a change in assessment order. So on AP03, the project presentation will be conducted second, and finally the portfolio-based interview will then be conducted, and it's still business as usual. It's still conducted remotely. Now, this was addressed in the 2 previous webinars, so if you haven't got or haven't attended any of the previous webinars, you can click on the link there or copy the links there for the January webinar, which is the very first introductory webinar, followed by the March webinar. So if you watch them in order, that will give you a good understanding of where we're at. And obviously now we're looking at the next steps. So the practical changes to what's going to be happening, like we said, knowledge test is completed first, then the portfolio-based interview, which will last 30 to 45 minutes. I'm going to introduce a break there for up to 15 minutes to basically support the learner and the LIEPA. And then the presentation will happen, which is up to 15 minutes, followed by a Q&A around that of 10 to 15 minutes. So the new version of the standard then, the knowledge test completes in advance. Now we know currently that that's not always possible, and that's fine, but by the time October comes around, hopefully we should have returned to some form of normality. Presentation 10 to 15 minutes again, Q&A based on the project 10 to 15 minutes. We're then going to introduce a 30-minute break on the new process, and then the portfolio-based interview of 30 to 45 minutes. The reasons for this now is because we can now use some methods of holistic marking between the two. So that 30-minute break will allow the LIEPA time to process what's been evidenced originally in the presentation. And then if there is cases of where some holistic marking can happen, that will then potentially impact the portfolio-based interview. So that 30-minute break will certainly support the LIEPA as well as the apprentice. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Judy, who's going to look at the mapping of assessment methods and the criteria coverage.
Thank you, Dom. So just to give you a bit of explanation behind what I will show you in the next slides, the way basically the assessment criteria are spread across the different assessment method is guided by whether the KSB's competencies are mapped into one assessment method only. And when this is the case, then they must be assessed in that method alone. Whilst instead, where the competencies, the knowledge, skills and behaviors are mapped into more than one assessment method, then in that case, what we have tried to do is approximately 50% of the knowledge, skills and behaviors which are linked to either of the assessment method, they must be achieved in each of these assessment methods. And this is really because now the 3 assessment methods, so the knowledge test, the portfolio-based interview, and the project presentation, they now carry equal weighting, which means that they have equal contribution towards the overall apprenticeship grade. One important thing to note is also that, as Dom mentioned, the first assessment method will be, well, it's ideally the knowledge test, which will be followed by the project presentation. In the case where after the project improvement presentation and question and answer, there are still some KSBs which are not they're not being sufficiently met during this assessment method, these may be picked up by the independent endpoint assessor as part of the portfolio-based interview. Okay, so if we can have a look at the next slide, please. So this is the mapping of the assessment method criteria coverage. And I just wanted to let you know that this document, the full document, is actually available as an appendix within the customer pack, which is available on the website, currently on the website. It's also available as a separate document to download again from the website. What I've tried to do with this document is kind of give you a visual of how the different modules are assessed. So each module will have a number of passes and distinction, and they will be assessed in different assessment methods. I will go through a few modules only, but I just wanted to remind you that in the previous webinar, I went in more details about these document, so it will be important to perhaps listen to that recording again. But so if we start with IT, for instance, we can see that IT is made of 2 passes, pass 1 and pass 2, and of 2 distinctions, D1 and D2. So in terms of the 2 passes, they are under a white background, which means that these criteria will be assessed by both the portfolio-based interview and the project presentation. So in this document, when you see anything that has a white background, it means that the combination of assessment method is being assessed within both the portfolio interview and project presentation. There are actually only a few cases, a few criteria which are assessed in both. And IT in this case, it does, because obviously it applies to both the assessment methods. While, for instance, the distinction D1 and D2 will just be assessed as part of the portfolio-based interview. So when we divided the criteria, we were trying to see where they would most naturally fall. And this is obviously to avoid repetition and double assessing between the different assessment methods. If instead we look at record and document production, this is actually a module which is just assessed in one single assessment method, which is the portfolio-based interview, which is highlighted in green. When you see that anything that is highlighted in green, it will mean that it will be assessed within the portfolio-based interview only. So you can see here all the passes, pass 1, pass 2, and pass 3, and all the distinction are within this assessment method only. If instead we look at another module, for example, decision making, for instance, is made of 3 passes, pass 1, pass 2, and pass 3, and then 4 distinctions from D1 to D4. This is highlighted in yellow, which means it will be assessed only in the project presentation. So this module will be assessed in one assessment method only, which is the project presentation. Instead, we look at another module, for instance, communication. This is a mix. So you can see that from pass 1 to pass 3, these criteria will be assessed as part of the project presentation only, and they are highlighted in yellow. Then you got the 4th pass, which is pass 4, which will be assessed in the portfolio-based interview only, and that will be the case for the distinction 2 and the distinction 3. while instead distinction 1 will be assessed both in the portfolio interview and project presentation. So I think Liz will go in a bit more details later on, where there are criteria, for instance, that are covered in both assessment methods. There will be opportunities for realistic assessment. So if there is very strong evidence, for instance, within the project presentation, for instance, for D1, that does apply to the interview, then we will take that into consideration and not double assess it. So if we can have a look, for instance, at the next module, which is value of their skills, this is another combination where basically it's just divided between two assessment methods, which are the portfolio interview, which will assess the past one, the distinction 1, and then the distinction 3. While the past 2 and distinction 2, which are highlighted in yellow, will just be assessed as part of the project presentation. So again, in the previous webinar, I went in a lot more details. So if you look at the document and listen to the recording, you will see that there will be other colors and all the modules that are within the standards that will have some, the orange will go by the orange color, grade and pitch. So please refer to it. In terms of the EPA documentation that is available on the website, so we have the customer pack and the recording forms. In the customer pack, which goes by the number 947322, you will find the assessment specification, the timeline from gateway till EPA, and the record of achievement, so from the beginning to the end, the whole process of EPA. You will find the tasks for the apprentices and for the training providers, centers and employers. You will find the grading descriptors for each of the assessment methods, and then obviously the mapping document that I refer to, which again is available to download separately as well. Then you will have the recording forms with the different templates, for instance, for the project presentation. And then we also have available the knowledge test guidance for the Evolve test for the 9473-301, which will tell you in details what is the depth and breadth of content that must be covered as part of the knowledge test in order to prepare your apprentices to take the knowledge test. Okay, I think now I will hand over to our LIEPA, Liz Henderson, to go through a bit more details about the different modules. Thank you.
Thanks, Juicy. As I said, I've been introduced, I am one of the lead independent assessors for business admin, along with Sylvia and Louise, who many of you will probably have met already. We've been helping Juicy to develop the support materials, so we've got to know the new assessment plan quite well. And what I'm intending to do now is to address some of the more practical implications of the new plan for you and your apprentices. So if you attended the last two webinars, many of your questions should have been answered, but today, in response to the FAQs and feedback, which came across to us after the last two webinars, I'm going to focus on the following areas. I'll clarify how the assessor question for the project works. Then I'll give you an overview of the difference between a pass apprentice and a distinction apprentice. I think a lot of people want to focus on that. Then I'll follow up with another look at the competencies or assessment criteria that have posed the most problems in the past. Louise did look at these last time, but some of those can bear being re-emphasised. And finally, another quick look at the resources available to help you on Smart Screen and Pro, which have been updated. So moving on to the project improvement presentation question. Juicy spoke about this last time, and I just want to clarify the process for you. As you know, the project needs to be submitted to us at Gateway so that we can provide you with a question to answer within the presentation. The standard lists these 3 example questions. How have you improved a process or operating practice? What were the steps you took to implement the project? What worked well? How would you improve the results in future? The question we ask will be specific to the project and may well be based on an area of potential weakness that the LIEPA has identified by looking through the submitted report. This will give the apprentice the chance to make sure that this area is covered in the presentation rather than having it followed up in the question and answer session. 8 days from Gateway having been passed, this allocated question will be available on EPA Pro. At the moment, it's the responsibility of the centre to check and prompt the apprentice when the allocated question is received, but later on, hopefully this will be an automatic notification which is set up. But at the moment, just make sure that you check for it. So how should the question be addressed? The answer to the question must be included in the presentation. So obviously the final presentation can't be submitted or completed until the question has been asked. The presentation must include the KSBs listed in the assessment plan, the aim, outcome, responsibilities involved, and how the task or tasks were approached, and the skills shown in doing so, as well as the answer to the question that's been posed. The answer, though, could be incorporated into the presentation. It may be that it is addressed holistically through the presentation. For example, answering the question, how have you improved a process or operating practice, would quite possibly be covered in the body of the presentation itself. But it may be that one additional slide will be sufficient. For example, answering what went well and how could you improve the results in the future could be addressed in a final conclusion. The endpoint assessment pack and the exemplar resources give detailed examples on what must be included in the final presentation. So in order for us to set a relevant question based on the project, we ask for a report to be submitted at Gateway, which includes the following: scoping, planning, managing, communicating with stakeholders, monitoring and reporting the results of your project, and a reflection on what could have been improved. That's already listed in the current standard as well. There is a template attached to the centre documents that Juicy referred to. As long as this content is included, the format itself doesn't really matter. Until the question has been asked, the presentation can't be finalised. It's not a requirement that the final presentation be submitted to City and Guilds before EPA. Many centres currently do, and we are happy for you to continue to do so, in which case you would probably submit it at the same time as the portfolio of evidence 2 weeks before the EPA. To move on to the mapping of the assessment criteria, Juicy's already gone into this in great detail, and but I just think it's worth mentioning it again to emphasise how vital this document is for you and your apprentices as they prepare for endpoint assessment. I know everyone is concerned about the change to 100% achievement of pass and distinction, which all awarding organisations need to adhere to, and how this could have an impact on success rates. But the changes in how the assessment criteria are covered, making the 3 assessment methods of equal weighting, has meant that they will be more balanced and there will be much less duplication. We have been guided to split the competencies into where they fall most naturally, and have done so in this document, taking the worry away from you in terms of knowing what is going to be assessed where. Additionally, where units or modules are assessed across both methods, as Juicy has already said, holistic marking will support the apprentice by reducing the amount of assessment duplication. This is a more positive method of assessment, where the IEP is looking at the apprentice's evidence as a whole, rather than having to pursue the same topics in each of the assessments. As a result, the number of competencies in each method has been reduced so that the apprentice can focus better on covering what needs to be demonstrated in their portfolio-based interview and in their project presentation. Along with the EPA assessment pack, this is your fundamental go-to resource. All centres and training providers, as well as employers and apprentices, need to be thoroughly familiar with and working constantly with this document to ensure that they understand what needs to be done. So, how can we ensure our programmes end in success? What does success look like? We already have apprentices that achieve 100% success under the current assessment plan. Invariably, the successful apprentice has a portfolio of learning that is well indexed and directly relates to the competencies, the areas of knowledge, skills and behaviours that they need to explain to the assessor. They will have good examples that they can draw on easily and fluently based on their experiences at work. Their project clearly reflects how they have demonstrated the requisite KSBs. It won't just be a story of what happened or a detailed description of the finished product that they've worked on. It shows they've considered how best they can demonstrate the KSBs that are being tested, the decisions they made, the project management tools they used, the processes that they observed. Thirdly, apprentices need to understand the terminology used in the assessment plan. You would be surprised at how often apprentices ask for questions to be rephrased because they appear not to understand words such as peers, logistics, or even resources. And above all, the successful apprentice's employer, their employer, has understood what the expectations are of a level 3 business administrator and has given them the opportunity to develop responsibility in their role and to support others in theirs. So, what makes a distinction grade apprentice? If I go through the 2 assessment methods and highlight some of the things that they need to be focused on. Let's examine what pushes them into the distinction grade. Firstly, the portfolio-based interview. Consistency. Consistency features in many of the KSBs. For example, in IT, communications quality, they consistently show their competence. How can this be demonstrated in the process of assessment? Good examples, confidently spoken about, references to positive feedback over time. This is what we're looking for. Secondly, being proactive. The distinction apprentice will take it upon themselves to develop their own skills, offer coaching, influence and challenge peers and managers, come up with good ideas, promote good practice, particularly in regulations and policies, act as a role model internally to colleagues, and externally act as an ambassador on behalf of the organisation. This requires the employers to trust them in positions of responsibility, but it's also the apprentice who needs to show they can be trusted to take these on. Lastly, being responsive. The distinction apprentice will be self-motivated and respond to feedback, continually assess their own work for accuracy and potential improvement, always show integrity in owning up to any mistakes, evaluate the impact of change, use the evaluation to improve their performance. This is down to the apprentice rather than anything the employer is responsible for, but it's something that should be highlighted for an aspiring apprentice to understand. So to move on to an example of a pass versus distinction apprentice, I have chosen the same modules actually as Juicy did. So if we use these as an extract from the mapping document to highlight that this shows that coaching will be tested in the portfolio-based interview. So that can be found easily. For a pass here in interpersonal skills, the apprentice needs to show that they can support others in the organisation and demonstrate coaching skills. For a distinction, they need to proactively offer to coach others and have good performance recorded in feedback. So in response to a question about coaching, a pass level answer could be about how the apprentice has been asked to support a colleague in completing a task, note having been asked, by showing them how to do something. They check they understand, sure that they could do it independently afterwards. A distinction answer, though, might be where they had noticed a colleague struggling and offered to support them, possibly taking on the responsibility over a period of time. This resulted in positive feedback from their colleague or their manager, which is referred to in the answer given. The distinction apprentice will know what is required to answer that question about coaching because they will be familiar with the competencies in the standard. Although the assessor might probe their answers to get additional insights into the circumstances of the coaching referred to, the distinction apprentice will give good, detailed answers that meet these criteria without having to spend extra time answering further questions. Coaching and supporting colleagues comes up in 4 different KSB areas, both in pass and distinction criteria, so it's really worth getting this right. There are actually no tricks in endpoint assessment. Tricky corners, yes, but everything that needs to be demonstrated is laid out for you, the employer and the apprentice in the EPA pack and mapping document. So if we can move on to the project improvement presentation, what makes a distinction grade apprentice? Here the choice of project is key, be it for a pass or distinction. But for a distinction, it needs to be significant. It's a bit of a vague subjective term until you look at the other distinction criteria. A significant project will be substantial, complex, involve interaction with a range of stakeholders where strong leadership can be demonstrated. Sorting out the stockroom is a valid project and one which could easily achieve a pass, but it quite possibly won't allow the apprentice to demonstrate the requisite skills in sufficient depth and breadth to gain a distinction. The choice of project will very much depend on the employer and how much responsibility they're prepared to give to the apprentice, so their full engagement in this process and understanding of what is needed is vital. Although the project should not be initiated before month 9 of the apprenticeship, early discussions about what would be suitable are helpful, as the choice of a suitable project is often as challenging as carrying it out. An apprentice may well have a role in a wider company initiative. This is not a problem in itself, but they must be able to show what their individual responsibility was, what decisions they took, and why. A big red flag to an assessor is a constant reference to "we did this, we did that" in the presentation and in the answers, often leading to the question, well, what did you actually do? Decision-making and project management are both KSB areas which are exclusive to the project and improvement presentation assessment method, so cannot be explored further in the portfolio-based interview. This is their only chance for achieving these criteria in this particular assessment method. A distinction-seeking apprentice needs to show strong leadership skills, i.e. they have to be in charge and actively planning the different stages of the project and quite possibly managing a team, even if it's a small one. In the planning, they will demonstrate they have a strong grasp of project management tools. Note the plural, more than one. All of these criteria are in the assessment plan and mapping document for you to explore and discuss with the apprentice and their employer. So to move on to a specific example of a pass versus distinction apprentice in decision making. For a pass here, the apprentice needs to show that their decisions made during the project improvement process are thought through using a range of information to make a sound judgment. For the related distinction, they need to show that their decisions are continuously made by thoughtfully considering different information and the risks of any action. So to gain a pass, the presentation should show the apprentice has had to make decisions independently and why they made them. What was the basis for these decisions? For a distinction, they would have been making more decisions, necessitated by the project being significant or more complex, and the decisions are therefore based on a wider range of information, perhaps responding to changing circumstances. While making those decisions, they need to consider the risks involved and what could be done to overcome them. That's a really complex criterion. All parts of it must be evidenced, i.e. decisions, the range of information, and the risks involved. So you can see the difference in scope between the pass and distinction criteria are quite clearly illustrated in this example. So having talked about those differences, I want to move on to tricky corners. Those examples can hopefully guide you to support your apprentices to achieve the highest possible grade and certainly to achieve a pass. But, however, even at pass level, there are some tricky corners to look out for. Louise went through these in great detail last webinar. She identified the trends and problems, and I'm not going to repeat everything she talked about, so please go back to the recording of the March webinar for more details, and Dom gave you the links at the beginning of this particular session. So looking at tricky corners, I'm taking extracts from the mapping document again to show how it works in practical terms, and you can see how the colour coding helps you to determine how a particular criterion is expected to be assessed, as Juicy's already explained. Starting off with IT, it's an area where apprentices will naturally show competence in both project presentation and the portfolio-based interview. The tricky corner, using IT to analyse information. Most apprentices analyse information on a daily basis, but they need to talk about this in one or other of the assessments. You can see here the requirements for the distinction criteria that I referred to earlier, the need for consistency and the need to demonstrate coaching skills. We're moving on to interpersonal skills. Working with a range of people is going to come out naturally across both assessments. We expect challenge and influence to be evidenced in the project, as new ideas or processes will often lead to influencing and having to challenge peers and managers. This is an area common to both assessment methods, so follow-up questions by the assessor may come within the project presentation or the portfolio-based interview, as Juicy already explained. But the important thing is that the apprentice has evidence of challenging peers and managers for distinction. If they say, "We're a great team, we never have any problems," they won't meet these criteria. Challenge doesn't have to be about actual conflict. It could be about reminding a colleague about the new process. It could be about having to discuss something with a manager that they don't feel confident about, but they stick to their guns. Conflicts and challenges always happen in the workplace. It's often the case that the apprentice can't think of anything when put on the spot, but if they're well prepared, they should be able to come up with some good examples. Those of you with eagle eyes will notice that within decision making, an area tested only in the project improvement presentation, there is also a criterion about challenging others appropriately and being polite when doing so. Moving on to communications. Another area tested in both assessment methods. Most of the criteria are easily evidenced, but this distinction in communications, which we expect to see in the portfolio-based interview, is something apprentices struggle with. It's important to understand the word championing, which is about encouraging others to use innovative communication methods, such as social media, Teams or Zoom, or thinking outside of the box to get messages across. Now, it's worth noting that if the whole project is about championing a new method of communication, this would quite probably not be asked about in the portfolio-based interview. That's where the holistic assessment is very useful. So if we can move to planning and organisation. Planning and organisational skills are fundamental to success in a business administrator role. And there are definitely some tricky corners here. At pass level, apprentices have to manage resources and manage or organise meetings. If they don't, they will not pass. So conversations with employers are important here to make sure they have the right opportunities. At level 3, they're not expected to run a board meeting, but they could be planning and running meetings to discuss their project, meet their assessor, arrange regular team meetings, or organise team events. Logistics is a term that many apprentices are often puzzled by, but they need to understand the term and know what they have to do to provide suitable evidence to meet the criteria both at distinction and pass level. The definition of logistics refers to the process of managing how resources are acquired, stored and arrive at their final destination. We can consider examples such as arranging travel, accommodation, stock control, planning events. At distinction level, of course, we're looking for responsibles with suitable breadth and depth. Again, the word proactive is key, but the apprentice needs to be able to give excellent examples. So that's a unit that is divided between the two assessment methods. The project will necessitate careful planning to ensure results are achieved and may well be about improving processes or saving money. If in the course of their project they show they've managed meetings and resources, these won't be questioned further in the portfolio-based interview. With strict time constraints of 45 minutes for the portfolio-based interview and 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, we don't have enough time to be duplicating answers. So, stakeholders, another area which can be evidenced in either of the two assessment methods. The path is straightforward, evidence naturally, and directly relates to the distinction criteria of going beyond expectations, not just making a cup of tea, but doing something outside their normal job role. The first distinction for understanding and following the principles of stakeholder management is a very tricky corner. Currently, few apprentices manage to evidence. In these two assessment methods, understanding is not enough. There has to be evidence of applying the principles. So, for example, when managing their stakeholders, how was communication differentiated between different stakeholders and why? As this is a topic that may have to be explored in more detail, we expect it to be covered in the portfolio-based interview. The last area I want to look at in detail is personal qualities. Personal qualities are a bit vague, really. It's a bit sort of personal, and as in the name, but it's quite difficult to evidence as a result. It can often be assessed holistically, but apprentices need to think about how they demonstrate these traits during their assessments. If asked, can they think of an explicit example of how they have shown integrity? And for distinction, it's back to the proactivity I was speaking of earlier. How have they successfully encouraged others to show these qualities, i.e. of integrity, reliability, positivity, self-motivation? How do they do this? What examples can they give? So that's my quick whistle-stop tour of the tricky corners. But as I say, if you look at the trends and information that Louise gave you last time, you will get more details about all of the different KSBs. And I have focused on how to maximise the marks for your apprentices. But finally, it's worth repeating, this is Louise's slide from last time. If an apprentice currently fails on a particular area, it's likely to be one of these three, all tested in the portfolio-based interview. Apprentices must be able to discuss at least 2 relevant laws or regulations, internal policies and external environment factors, and then talk about how these apply to their own job role within the organisation. They must be relevant to the apprentice's job. For example, an apprentice might quote the manual handling policy that applies on the factory floor, but they need to comment on how they also need to be trained and observe this policy when moving boxes or files within the office. A company aim of reducing carbon emissions is a factor that affects the organisation, but how does this affect them in their job role? In the case of brain freeze during the EPA, which can happen, of course, don't forget the apprentice should have their portfolio with them and is permitted to look up examples within it. But bear in mind the time constraints of the interview. If everything has to be looked up, this will affect how much time the assessor has to probe answers, which might support them to a higher grade. So, in conclusion, there should be no surprises here. All the grading criteria are clearly set out in the endpoint assessment pack. How these criteria are divided between the different assessment methods is set out in the colour-coded mapping document in the annex to the pack, but also in the grids under each assessment section. Apprentices need to understand what is expected of them. Employers need to understand what is expected and support their apprentices by allowing them to develop relevant experience, skills and behaviours. And centres need to make sure these things happen. So just to refer again to the resources which have been mentioned previously, we have updated all the exemplar material which is on the Smart Screen platform and will be on Pro as well. And these support materials will be available on the platforms by the end of next week. The exemplar materials give advice and guidance about around the three components, including full guides for the knowledge test, which is what Juicy's referred to before, a practice test paper, what to expect from the project presentation, what to include in the portfolio of learning, practical advice for preparing for the assessments both ahead of time and on the day itself. The Apprentice Training Manual has been updated with additional practical exercises and case studies to help the development of the apprentices' required KSBs, particularly at distinction level, and are directly linked to the standard. So it's a really useful teaching resource which is equally applicable for both assessment plans. The annual Lead Independent Endpoint Assessors report includes useful information about trends in good and less good performance, as well as recommendations for improvements. So it's well worth a read. These resources are available, as I said, on both platforms. And hopefully the updated ones should be with you by halfway through next week, which is great. I hope what I've been talking about has been useful for you. Thank you for listening. And if there is a bit of time, yes, we do have a bit of time, I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Much appreciated, Liz. Thank you very much. Okay, so just to reiterate then to how to locate the EPA documents, Liz did mention the EPA packs. They are available, and so did Judy. They are available on both the website and EPA Pro. So all of you now should have moved across to EPA Pro. And so you can see there on the right-hand side screenshot under EPA pack, that's where they obviously would be stored. The website is slightly different. Obviously, we do have version 1 and the new version there. So if you were to add in 9473 into the search bar on the City and Guilds website, obviously the Business Administrator Apprenticeship would come up because that's the code, the generic code, the umbrella code. And for the version 1, so anybody starting before the 10th of September, they would be on version 1. That there would be in the Documents tab, the first drop down, and all the documentation associated to that would be found there. Likewise, for the current version to the new version 947322, so AP03, make sure that you are choosing the correct documentation. So that's the second drop down tab there, and in there will be the specific EPA packs for that relevant version. There is a link on there which will take you directly to the website, the web page rather, for 9473. And remembering that you will get a copy of this recorded webinar within normally 3 hours of the end of it, depending on how long the system takes to download and send out via email. If you don't get it for whatever reason, we have had situations whereby it's gone onto junk box or it's been stopped by firewalls as spam, etc. Please do look within the week on our website under the qualifications tab, where I will upload a digital version of this recorded webinar. Okay, so just to reiterate now how you can further be supported, we have changed our centre support number, so it's now an 01924 number, which is should be cheaper if you're ringing from a mobile phone, etc. And you can also contact customer services at centresupport@cityandguilds.com. Again, if you need further help for Walled Garden, Smart Screen or Evolve, please click on the link there to City and Guilds Help for Centres. Just a reminder of our Business Skills webpage, which is where you will find all updates and recorded webinars, as well as the frequently asked questions. So after today's session, we will obviously be creating a final FAQ. We will incorporate all of the previous webinars FAQ into one document and upload it to our website. You can contact me directly for any queries that you might have, and at that particular email, dominic.green@cityandguilds.com. And then just to reiterate again, we will be doing another webinar in the late summer time and date to be arranged, but that will cover a bit of a recap, the processes involved, and preparing you really for the first endpoint assessments that are going to go through from October onwards. We don't anticipate anybody before that because of the 366-day rule, bearing in mind that learners will have only started from the 10th of September 2020 onwards. Finally, if you didn't hear about this webinar via any email updates, if it was a colleague that maybe mentioned it or somebody else registered you, if you want to receive email updates, we strongly recommend that you do sign up. It will give you information about reminders about upcoming webinars. It will give you information about any assessment plan changes, any new changes that are going to happen that come out from IFATE. It will all be communicated via email updates. So if you're not signed up, please do click on that link and register your interest. You can be specific about the sector that you want to receive information about. So that means that you won't receive unwanted emails from other areas. And of course, if you are already signed up and you're still not receiving information around, say, business skills specifically or apprenticeships, you may need to go back in and update your preferences to ensure that you do get those email updates. Okay, we have got a bit of time. We've got 5 minutes or so to look at questions and answers. So I'm just going to bear with me a minute while I unpin our question pane to see if we've had any questions. Okay, I can see some. Bear with me a minute. Hoping that as we've gone along, we have answered the majority. Remembering that if we haven't, we will obviously create that that document. Okay, so I'll try and start from the top. So the first question that's come through from Elise is, if learners are also completing the diploma, is the 301 knowledge test the same? So there is a non-mandatory diploma which centres can run, which will add value to your provision. It is called the 3473 Diploma in Business Administration, and it directly links to endpoint assessment. Now, it's not a condition of endpoint assessment that that's done, it's non-mandatory. However, the content is very similar and it prepares the learners extremely well for EPA. Within that diploma, there is a 301 unit, which covers the principles of business, which is extremely similar to the knowledge test in the endpoint assessment. So it's not exactly the same, but obviously because the topic is the same, we are going to see quite a crossover there of questions, because essentially it's the principles of business that's being tested in both the 301 diploma and the 301 EPA test. We have had a couple of comments about the sound, so apologies about that if it has been an issue. Priscilla says, if an employer needs a project to start earlier than month 9, then can this be done? We understand that this can be a predicament for employers because naturally occurring projects do crop up before month 9. However, the assessment plan has stated that the project cannot start until at least month 9. So unfortunately, that is a no. Now, if there's a naturally occurring project that happens before month 9, then it might well be worthwhile the learner conducting that project, not for the purpose of endpoint assessment for the project itself, but any evidence that's generated from that project might be fit for purpose to go into the portfolio. It might be then that actually, to complete the endpoint assessment part of the project, a further project or a follow-on project could be done off the back of the original project, providing that started after month 9. But obviously you would need to be aware of making sure that there's sufficient content there to do a second project on a follow-up project on what could be improved, etc. Some centres do that, or some centres prefer to start afresh. Okay, a question for Liz from Sue. In the mapping document, comms D2 states it comes under the portfolio. Liz has just stated that could be covered by the project. I'm confused. Okay, thanks, Sue. Presumably D2, Liz, is one that is holistically marked. Could you advise?
Yeah, the communications is one of the units that can be mapped across to either the project portfolio, the project presentation, or the portfolio-based interview. And in the quest for not to double assess and looking at things more holistically, how AP3 is presenting this is if you've demonstrated really well that you have covered a particular criterion in the project before you get to the portfolio-based interview, then we won't have to ask you that question again. It's because it can be assessed in either. The distinction about which area is included in which is a guide for you, really. It's not completely exclusive, but we do need to try and make each of the assessments weighted evenly, which is how we've decided to break up the criteria into where they're most naturally assessed. As I said, the distinction in missions about how they've championed a particular education method is something that often enough will not come up in a project. So that's why we've put it into the portfolio-based interview.
Thanks, Liz. Much appreciated.
There's another question there that I noticed actually about the questions on the portfolio-based interview, and from Janet, the questions appear standalone and not based on any content that may have been included in the portfolio. My understanding was the interview is based on the portfolio content and aims to expand on this rather than be standalone questions. The portfolio-based interview gives us the context and the questions that could be asked about based on what the apprentice has presented to us, and they will be contextualized, or should be contextualized, in the information already given. So it should be referenced, but it's not exclusive, because a lot of the time the portfolio will not include all of the grading criteria, if you like, the descriptors that they need to meet and so forth. Therefore, sometimes there will be additional questions or questions that could be standalone, but the question on coaching should actually already be included. There should be plenty of evidence within the portfolio, in which case the evidence within the portfolio will be explored further in the questions that are asked.
Thanks, Liz. We do have another one on interpersonal skills P1 from Sue. It says that it maps to both the portfolio and the project. Liz has just stated will be assessed in one or the other. Did you mean the other P's and D's and not P1, as this is an and?
Again, it's a holistic assessment.
Yeah.
So yes, if there is overwhelming evidence for something that's been presented in the portfolio, it's all these P's. If there is overwhelming evidence within the project improvement presentation that they have met these criteria, we would not question them further within the portfolio-based interview. But if that particular ASB, that module has to be assessed in one area or the other, we don't have that flexibility. So, for example, decision making or project management cannot be followed up within the portfolio-based interview. So it is a bit confusing about the and/or, but it's a question of how much evidence has been included. And because we're looking at this much more holistically, we don't need to have to keep asking the same questions, which under the current assessment plan we do, because they have to be covered in both. So it's more satisfying, really, that we can look at them holistically and say, yeah, they have really demonstrated well that they can do all sorts of IT and analyze. So therefore, we're not going to ask them any questions about that in the portfolio-based interview, unless to clarify something they've said for the distinction criteria.
Thanks, Liz. Much appreciated. There are a couple of process questions. A question regarding the planning meeting. Will the EPA date still be set at 60 days from that particular date? No, as we've transferred across to EPA Pro, we are finding that the turnaround time is a lot less. Generally, we're looking at 4 weeks from the planning dates at the moment, but that could be less or more. But we're generally finding that 30 days is the norm from the planning dates. In the new EPA pack under end assessment timeline, there is no mention of the planning meeting. How will this be managed? That will be managed on EPA Pro. If you haven't got access to EPA Pro, then Sue, then it might be worthwhile trying to find your primary user at your college to set you up with access. And final question. We are running out of time, unfortunately, but we will address all the questions and put them in the FAQ document, as I said. The assessment plan version 3 states that the portfolio must be submitted to the EPA 1 month prior. I am assuming it is the 10 days as stated, not 1 month. We actually work on 2 weeks prior to endpoint assessment. So you can submit the portfolio no later than 2 weeks prior to the endpoint assessment. And if you are wishing to submit the PowerPoint as well, then that would be a nice time to submit it as well. You don't have to, it's not a prerequisite. However, many centres do like to submit it along with the portfolio. So that will be 2 weeks prior to endpoint assessment, not 2 minutes. Getting a bit carried away there. Okay, we are just after 11 o'clock. So what we will do as a team, we will look at the questions that are unanswered again and form a FAQs document. Please bear with us while we do this. We will need to make sure there's no duplication from the previous webinar. And once complete, we will upload to our website. Okay, that just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's very much appreciated on our behalf. It's great to see lots of you interacting and attending. And have a very nice day and a great rest of the week from all at City and Guilds. Thank you.